The phone call came at 6:47 in the morning, and Marcus Hale was already at his desk. He had been awake since 5, not because anything was wrong, but because something always needed his attention before the rest of the world got up. That was the way he operated. Early, efficient, 2 steps ahead of every problem before it became one. His company moved freight across 14 states, employed over 300 people, and turned a profit that made other logistics executives go quiet at industry dinners. Marcus had built it from a single leased truck and a phone with a cracked screen. He had not done that by sleeping in. The call was from his father's neighbor, a woman named Carol who lived next door to Walter Hale and had been quietly watching over him for the past few months without being asked and without being paid. She was 70 herself. She had a bad hip and a good heart, and she called Marcus the way a person calls when they have been putting it off for too long. She told him she had found his father standing in the front yard at 2 in the morning the night before. Walter was in his socks, just his socks, standing on the wet grass, looking at the street like he was waiting for a bus that didn't exist anymore. She had gone out, taken his arm gently, and walked him back inside. He had thanked her politely and called her by the wrong name. He had called her Eleanor. Eleanor was Marcus's mother. She had been gone for 11 years. Marcus thanked Carol. He told her he would handle it. He hung up, stared at the wall for exactly 30 seconds, and then opened his laptop and started searching. He was not a man who did well with feelings that didn't point toward a solution. This one pointed toward one. His father needed help, real and consistent help, and Marcus was going to hire the best person available and make sure the situation was managed properly. That was what he did. He managed things. He posted the job listing by 7 in the morning. By noon, he had 42 applications. By the end of the week, he had interviewed 12 candidates in a single long afternoon, one after another, each one sitting across from him in his home office while he asked the same structured questions and took notes on a yellow legal pad. Qualifications, experience, references, certifications. He ranked them numerically. He was not unkind during the interviews, but he was not warm either. This was a staffing decision, and he treated it accordingly. He had almost made his choice when the 13th application came in, a day after he thought he was done looking. Her name was Rosalind Ferreira, 61 years old, born in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. She had trained as a nurse in her home country, worked for 2 decades in a hospital setting, then came to the United States 16 years ago and shifted into private home care. Her references were not just good. They were the kind of references that made Marcus slow down and read every word twice. One family had written 3 full pages, not a form letter. 3 handwritten pages describing what Rosalind had done for their grandmother over 18 months. The kind of specific and grateful detail that cannot be faked and cannot be bought. He called her in. She arrived wearing a gray blouse and sensible shoes. She did not bring a portfolio or a folder of printed documents. She brought herself, which was, Marcus would think much later, everything. She was a compact woman with silver hair pulled back and very steady eyes. The kind of eyes that were not performing calmness. The kind that actually had it. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on her lap and waited for him to begin. He asked his questions. She answered them without rushing, without trying to impress him, without the slightly nervous energy that every other candidate had carried into the room. When he asked what her philosophy was for caring for someone with early-stage cognitive decline, she did not give him a textbook answer. She said that most people in that situation are not confused as often as their families fear, but they are lonely far more often than anyone realizes, and loneliness, left alone long enough, looks a lot like confusion. Marcus wrote that down. He hired her by the end of the week. She arrived at Walter's house on a Tuesday, the first week of March, with one large rolling suitcase and a small tin that turned out to contain homemade shortbread cookies. The house was a three-bedroom brick home in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of the city. The house where Marcus and his sister Dana had grown up. The house where their mother Alina had planted roses along the back fence every spring for 22 years. Marcus gave Rosalind the full tour in just under 4 minutes. He showed her the bedroom that would be hers. He showed her the medication schedule he had printed and laminated and stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. He showed her the binder he had prepared with Walter's medical contacts, pharmacy information, emergency numbers, and a weekly report template he expected her to fill out and email to him every Sunday by 6 in the evening. He showed her the Wi-Fi password written on a card by the router. He did not ask her if she had any questions. He assumed if she did, she would email him. He did not ask her anything about herself. She did not offer. What Marcus did not see, because he left within 20 minutes of her arrival, was the moment Rosalind stood alone in the kitchen after he drove away and took in the room quietly. The faded curtains over the window. The chair pulled up to the small table at an angle that suggested one person eating alone every meal. The refrigerator covered in old appointment reminder cards and a single photograph held up by a magnet from a hardware store. A photograph of a woman laughing in a garden, roses behind her, sunlight catching her hair. Rosalind looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she opened the tin of shortbread, set it on the table, and went to find Walter. He was in the living room in his armchair, watching a program about fishing with the volume too loud. He was a tall man who had gotten thinner than he was meant to be, shoulders that had once carried real weight now sharp under his flannel shirt. He had a full head of white hair and a jaw that had probably been stubborn since birth. He looked up at Rosalind when she came in, and the look on his face was not welcoming. "I don't need a babysitter," he said. The volume of the television was very loud between them. Rosalind did not argue with him. She did not explain her qualifications or reassure him with the professional softness that people in her line of work sometimes learn to perform. She simply agreed with him. "I know," she said, "I'm not here for that." He looked at her with the particular suspicion of a man who had been handled too carefully by too many people recently. "Then what are you here for?" he said. She told him she was here to make sure he had good company, decent meals, and someone to drive him places if he wanted to go. She told him she would not hover. She told him the shortbread on the kitchen table was for both of them, and she was going to go make coffee, and if he wanted some, he could come through when his program was done. Then she went back to the kitchen and made the coffee. He came through 15 minutes later, the television still on in the other room. He sat down at the table without being invited, looked at the tin of cookies, took one and bit into it. He chewed. He looked at the table for a moment in the way that people do when something tastes like a memory. He said, "These are good." Rosalind set a mug of coffee in front of him, 2 sugars, 1 small splash of milk. She had not asked him how he took it. The spoon tapped twice on the rim of the mug before she set it down. Walter looked at the coffee. He looked at her. He didn't say anything else for a minute. Then he said, "My worst job was 3 winters in a row laying pipe in frozen ground outside Cleveland. 1971. Ground was so hard the drill bits wore down in 2 hours." Rosalind sat down across from him, wrapped both hands around her own mug, and listened. He talked for 45 minutes. Marcus's Sunday report that week was 3 lines long. Medication schedule followed correctly. Good appetite, slept well, no incidents. Marcus read it at his desk, nodded slightly to himself, and moved on to the next email. He had hired the right person. The situation was handled. He was wrong about what was happening inside that house, not wrong in the way that causes harm. Wrong in the way that people are wrong when they mistake management for presence, when they confuse keeping something running with actually understanding what it needs. The house was not simply being maintained. Something else was beginning. Marcus did not know it yet. Walter was starting to come back. Not back from somewhere dramatic or frightening. Back from the slow, gray withdrawal that had settled over him in the years since Eleanor died, the kind of withdrawal that doesn't have a name on a medical chart, but is visible in every room of a house where a person has been alone too long. He was starting to talk again, to eat breakfast at the table instead of standing at the counter, to mention things he saw out the window, to ask what day it was without embarrassment when he forgot. Small things. But anyone who has ever watched someone disappear slowly knows that the small things are everything. Marcus did not see any of this. He read the Sunday reports and noted the improvements with the same calm satisfaction he felt when a quarterly projection came in on target. What he missed was the shortbread on the table, the twice-tapped spoon, the 45 minutes of frozen ground in Cleveland. What he missed was Rosalind, sitting across from his father every morning, paying attention. It would take a while before he understood what that cost and what it was worth. He was still very busy. He was always very busy. But something had already shifted in that house on the east side of the city, quiet and steady and real, like the ground thawing after a long winter. He just hadn't looked down yet. The morning Rosalind found the recipe book, it was raining. Walter had asked her the night before if they had any flour, not because he wanted to bake. He had said it the way old people sometimes say things, a flicker of something remembered, a reach toward a habit the hand still knew even when the mind had gotten softer around the edges. Rosalind had said yes, there was flour in the cabinet, and she had watched him nod slowly and then drift back toward the television. She thought about it after he went to bed. In the morning, while the rain came down against the kitchen window and Walter was still asleep, she opened the cabinet above the bread box. The flour was there, in a white canister with a faded label. And behind it, leaning against the back wall of the cabinet, was a cookbook, old and soft-covered, the spine repaired with tape that had yellowed over time. She pulled it out carefully. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was small and precise and slightly slanted to the right, was a name, Eleanor Hale, and below the name a date, Christmas 1988. Rosalind set it on the counter and turned the pages slowly. Between many of the pages were small index cards slipped in and written on in the same careful hand. Not recipes exactly. Notes, reminders, personal adjustments, 2 sugars, 1 splash of milk. Let the bread rest longer in winter. Walter does not like cardamom. Do not put it in the cookies regardless of what the recipe says. She read through them quietly, the rain on the window, the house still and warm. She stood there for a long time. When Walter came into the kitchen 40 minutes later, still in his pajamas and moving carefully the way he did until his joints settled into the day, Rosalind had breakfast ready and the cookbook was back in the cabinet, exactly where she had found it. She had memorized what she needed. Walter sat down and looked at the plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, a small pot of jam. He looked at the jam. Eleanor used to get this kind, he said. I know, Rosalind said. He looked up at her. She set his coffee down, 2 sugars, 1 splash of milk. The spoon tapped twice on the rim. He didn't ask how she knew. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way he always did, and he looked out at the rain, and something in his face that had been tight for a very long time went quiet. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Walter had not had in years, not the rhythm of a schedule imposed by someone else, not the kind that felt like management, but the natural rhythm that comes when days have small rituals in them and someone is reliably there. Breakfast at the table, a walk if the weather allowed down to the end of the block and back, sometimes further, Walter setting the pace, Rosalind matching it without comment. Lunch. An afternoon where Walter could watch his programs or sit in the yard, and Rosalind read or cooked or moved around the house without intruding. Dinner together, always together. She cooked things she found in the cookbook. Not every night, and not making a production of it. Just quietly, slowly, the way food should be made, and Walter would come into the kitchen when he smelled something familiar and stand in the doorway and say nothing for a moment. He started sleeping through the night. His neurologist, a careful woman named Dr. Millionaire who had been treating Walter for 2 years, noted at his April appointment that his short-term retention had measurably improved. Not dramatically, not in a way that changed the underlying picture, but measurably. She asked what had changed in his daily routine. Walter said he had better company now. Dr. Nair wrote that down. Marcus read this in the Sunday report. He sent Rosalind a brief email that said she was doing a good job and to keep up the good work. Rosalind replied with the medication update for the week. It was not that Marcus was cold. It was that he had learned very early in his life that the way to take care of people was to handle things on their behalf, to solve the practical problems, to make sure the money was there, the right person was hired, the calendar was managed, the house was kept up. His father had worked 70-hour weeks when Marcus was small, not from indifference but from the same learned belief that providing was the same as being present. The two of them had never discussed it. It had just passed from one to the other the way certain things do, without language, through the way a son watches a father and decides, without knowing he is deciding, what a man is supposed to look like. It was Dana who first broke something open. Marcus's younger sister was 38, lived 40 minutes away, and worked as a landscape architect. She was quieter than Marcus in the way that people are quiet when they've decided that speaking up costs too much. She had been the one who stayed close to Alina in her final months, who had handled most of the small and tender things that needed handling, while Marcus managed the logistics. She had grieved, and she had grieved mostly alone, because Walter had gone stone silent and Marcus had gone back to work, and she had been 27 years old with no map for any of it. She visited on a Saturday in April, unannounced. She had meant to call ahead but kept putting it off and finally just got in the car. She walked around to the back door the way she always had as a kid, and she could hear voices inside before she reached the step. Her father's voice, and Rosalind's, and then, underneath both of them, the sound of her father laughing. Not politely, not the courtesy laugh she had heard him produce at family occasions. The real one, the one that came from somewhere low in the chest, the one she had not heard since her mother was alive. Dana stood on the back step and did not go in for a moment. Through the window she could see them at the table. Rosalind was showing Walter something in a small notebook, and Walter was shaking his head at it and saying something that made Rosalind laugh in return, and then he laughed again, and it was the realest sound in the world. Dana went inside. Walter looked up and his face opened. "There she is," he said. He said her name correctly. He said it without hesitation, which was not always the case anymore, and Dana felt the relief of it move through her like something physical. Rosalind stood and said she would put more coffee on, and did Dana want something to eat? There was bread she had just made. And Dana said yes please, and sat down at the table with her father, and the three of them spent 2 hours there while the Saturday moved around them. On the drive home, Dana pulled into a gas station parking lot 4 minutes from the house and sat in her car and cried. Not from sadness. The crying was from something harder to name, the complicated release of seeing your father be okay when you had stopped letting yourself believe he could be, the grief of all the Saturdays that had not looked like that one, the strange and aching gratitude that someone had come into that house and simply stayed in it. She sat there for a while, then she drove home. She called Marcus that evening. She told him she had visited. She told him it was good. She told him he should go sometime, not to check on things, just to go. He said he would. He said things were very busy right now, but he would find a time. She knew he meant it. She also knew what busy meant in his language. She let it go. The next time she visited, the following weekend, she went in through the front door and found Rosalind in the hallway, hanging a photograph on the wall. It was one of the photographs from the tin box Dana had not seen since childhood, a photograph of her parents at some kind of outdoor gathering, both of them young in the way that feels impossible to believe. Her mother with her head thrown back laughing, her father with his arm around her looking at her like she was the whole event. Dana stood and looked at it for a long time. "He asked me to put it up," Rosalind said. Dana nodded. She couldn't speak for a second. She followed Rosalind to the kitchen, and while Walter was out in the yard getting some air, she sat down at the table and Rosalind put coffee in front of her, and Dana looked at it and then looked at the woman across from her and said, without planning to, "He hasn't been okay in a long time." Rosalind said, "I know." Dana said, "None of us have, really." Rosalind didn't say anything. She just sat with it, the way she sat with most things, with the particular quality of attention that doesn't rush toward a fix or a comfort, but just remains. Dana said, "I didn't have anyone when my mother died. Marcus worked. Dad went somewhere I couldn't reach. I was 27 and I just handled everything, and then it was over and nobody ever talked about it again." Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady for a long time. Rosalind said, "That's a heavy thing to carry by yourself." "Yes," Dana said, "it was." They sat there. Walter came in from the yard, said his knees were complaining about the weather, sat down and asked if there was any of that bread left, and the conversation shifted, and the kitchen filled with the small sounds of an ordinary afternoon. But something had been set down. Dana could feel it. The particular weight of something finally put on a table after being carried too long. She stayed for dinner. She helped clear the plates. She hugged her father on the way out, a real hug, not the careful sideways one she had been giving him for years, and he hugged her back, his thin arms still surprisingly strong, and he said, "Come back soon," and she said she would. She meant it this time. On the drive home she thought about Marcus, about what Rosalind was doing in that house, without doing anything that could be pointed to and named. She thought about how a person could walk into a family that had gone silent and cold and simply be warm in it steadily, without demanding anything in return, until the cold started to give. She thought about her brother, at his desk at 5 in the morning, managing everything from a distance. She thought that some distances look like responsibility and feel like safety, until you realize what's actually on the other side of them. She thought about calling him again. She didn't, not yet. But she thought about it. And something in her knew, in the way that things are known before they are spoken, that whatever Rosalind had started in that house, it was not finished. It was barely begun. Marcus came on a Wednesday evening in May. He told himself he was coming to pick up a document his father had signed, a financial power of attorney that the family lawyer had sent over. It needed Walter's notarized signature, and it had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 2 weeks because Marcus kept meaning to arrange for a mobile notary and kept not getting around to it. He would pick it up, check in briefly, and leave. He arrived at 6:15, which was later than he planned. Traffic, always traffic. He came through the front door, and the house smelled like something cooking, something that stopped him for a second in the entryway without his permission. Garlic and olive oil, and something underneath that, something that pulled at him from a distance of decades. He had not smelled that combination since he was a child in that kitchen. He had not let himself think about that. He walked back. The kitchen table had 3 place settings on it. Walter was at the table, and Dana was at the table, and Rosalind was at the stove, and all 3 of them looked up when Marcus came in. Dana looked at him the way she had been looking at him lately, not unkindly, but with a new quality of assessment, like she was measuring something. Walter said, "You're just in time." Marcus said he wasn't staying for dinner. He just needed to pick up the document. It was on the counter. He looked for it. He found it. He held it in his hand and stood there in the kitchen his mother had cooked in for 22 years, and the smell of the food and the sound of the three of them and the three-place settings at the table all pressed at him at once, and he stood very still. Walter said, "Marcus, sit down." It was not a request. Marcus sat down. Rosalind brought the food to the table: chicken roasted with lemon, bread, a pot of something that turned out to be the bean stew from page 47 of his mother's cookbook, though Marcus did not know that yet. They ate. It was awkward at first, the way things are when people who have been careful with each other for a long time suddenly share a small space and real food. Marcus asked Walter about his last appointment. Walter answered, then turned the question and asked Marcus how work was going. Marcus said fine. Dana said something about a project she was working on, a rooftop garden for a building downtown. Walter asked questions. He was curious, engaged, interested in a way that Marcus had not seen in years. Marcus put his fork down for a second and watched his father listening to Dana talk. He picked it up again. After the food was cleared, Rosalind brought out tea and Walter disappeared to the living room to watch his program, and it was just Marcus and Dana at the table, which had not happened in a very long time. Dana said, "Do you remember that photograph in the hallway, the one she put up?" He did not need to ask who she was talking about. He said he had noticed it when he came in. Dana said, "There's a tin box full of them. Did you know that? Under Dad's bed. I didn't know about it until Rosalind found it." Marcus said he didn't know. There was a quiet between them. Dana said, "She found Mom's cookbook too, in the cabinet. Did you know it was there?" He had known and had not thought about it in years. He said, "I knew." Dana looked at him. He said, "I just didn't open it." The words landed in the room, and neither of them looked away from them. Dana said, "I think you should open the cabinet, Marcus." He didn't answer. Rosalind came back in to wipe down the counter, and the moment shifted, and Marcus helped carry his cup to the sink and said good night to his father, who was already absorbed in his fishing program. On the drive home, he thought about the cabinet. He thought about what it meant that a cookbook had sat in the same house he had managed from a distance for 11 years, and he had never once reached for it. He thought about efficiency, which was his great skill, and about how efficient he had been about keeping himself away from anything that required him to feel the weight of what his mother's absence had actually been. He was not a man who was good at this kind of thinking. He moved toward action. He solved problems. He did not sit inside questions. But the question sat inside him on that drive home, and it was still there when he got to his apartment and set his keys on the counter and stood in his own kitchen, which was clean and well-stocked and quiet in the way that spaces are quiet when they are well-maintained and rarely used for anything personal. He stood there for a while. Then he went to bed. He came back the following Saturday. He did not have a document to collect. Walter was in the yard when he arrived, sitting in the old lawn chair by the rose bushes that had come back this year, apparently, which was a surprise to everyone because nobody had tended them in years. They had come back anyway. Roses do that. Marcus sat in the other chair, which was dusty and slightly uneven in the legs, and the two of them sat in the yard while the morning was still cool, and Walter pointed out a bird on the fence and told Marcus what kind it was. Marcus did not know his father knew anything about birds. He said so. Walter said Alina had put a book about birds on his nightstand about 20 years ago, and he had read it mostly to make her happy and ended up keeping it. There was a quiet. Marcus said, "I didn't know that." Walter said, "There's a lot you didn't know. You were always very busy." It was not said with anger. Walter said it the way he might say that the weather had been cold this spring, a simple fact about the way things had been. Marcus felt it anyway. He said, "I know." Another quiet. Walter reached over and tapped Marcus once on the knee, a brief and deliberate touch, and then put his hand back on the arm of the chair. It was, Marcus thought, the most direct thing his father had said to him in 11 years. He sat in the dusty chair in the yard where he had grown up, with the roses his mother planted coming back from nothing, and his father pointing out a bird on the fence, and the morning moving at a pace he had not allowed his life to move at in a very long time. He did not look at his phone once. He stayed for 2 hours. When he went inside, Rosalind was in the kitchen. He asked her if he could look in the cabinet above the bread box. She said, of course, it was his father's house. He opened the cabinet and found the cookbook and pulled it out and stood at the counter and turned the pages slowly. He read every index card, all 37 of them. His mother's handwriting, small and precise, with all the small details of a life built for the people she loved. Notes about what Walter liked and didn't like. Adjustments made over years. A note on the last card, tucked into the back of the book, that said simply, "Make enough for leftovers because Marcus always comes back for seconds." He stood there for a long time. Rosalind did not say anything. She was doing something at the other counter, a few feet away, and she gave him the room to be inside it without witnessing it too closely. He closed the book. He put it back in the cabinet. He chose 3 index cards, held them carefully, and folded them once. He did not explain himself to anyone. He thanked Rosalind for dinner the previous Wednesday. She said he was welcome any time. He drove home. The 3 cards went on his refrigerator. He did not know what he was going to do with what he was feeling. He did not have a plan yet, but they were there on his refrigerator in his mother's handwriting, and that was something. That was for now enough. The change in Marcus Hale was not the kind of change that makes a good headline. There was no single moment, no dramatic conversation, no breakdown that cleared the air. It was slower and stranger than that. It was the kind of change that happens when a person begins showing up somewhere regularly without a reason and eventually stops needing one. He started coming on Saturdays, then occasionally on a Tuesday or Thursday evening if work ended at a reasonable hour. He did not announce these visits. He just came. He would walk in, say hello, and find somewhere useful to do or simply sit in the yard if the weather was right. Walter noticed. Walter said nothing about it for a few weeks, and then one Saturday he said, without looking up from his paper, "You're going to want to fix that gutter on the east side before summer. It's pulling away from the fascia." Marcus looked up at the gutter. It was pulling away from the fascia. He said he would take care of it. He came back the next weekend with a ladder and the right hardware and spent a Saturday morning fixing the gutter. Walter watched from the yard and offered opinions at regular intervals, most of which were correct. It was the most time they had spent together doing something practical since Marcus was a teenager. Dana came that afternoon and found them both outside, Marcus on the ladder, Walter below with unsolicited commentary, and she stood at the back door and watched them for a moment before either of them noticed her. She went inside and helped Rosalind in the kitchen. Rosalind said, without looking up from what she was doing, "He came last Tuesday too." Dana looked at her. Rosalind said, "He stayed an hour. They watched the fishing program together." Dana turned this over for a moment. She said, "Has he talked to you much, Marcus?" Rosalind said, "A little." "About?" "The house, your mother, things he found in the cookbook." Dana said, "He told you about the cookbook?" Rosalind said, "He asked me some questions about it, about where I found it, what was in it." She paused. "He's not a man who talks around things. When he's ready to say something, he says it directly." Dana thought about this. She said, "He wasn't always ready." "No," Rosalind said, "he wasn't." The thing about what Rosalind did in that house, the real thing, the one that was hard to put a name to, was that she did not try to fix anyone. That was the part that surprised people when they tried to understand it later. She was not a therapist. She was not a counselor. She did not sit people down and ask them to talk about their feelings or their grief or the years of careful distance they had built to survive inside their own family. She cooked, she listened. She paid attention to small details. She kept showing up warmly and without conditions every single day. That was the whole of it. And it turned out that was enough, because what the Hale family had been missing for 11 years was not advice or insight or intervention. It was someone being present in the house without an agenda. It was warmth in a space that had gotten very cold and stayed cold, because everyone who came through it was managing something and leaving quickly. Rosalind stayed. That changed everything. She had a habit of asking one real question per conversation. Not several, not a cascade of follow-up questions. One question, asked at the right moment, with the full weight of her attention behind it. It was a skill built over decades of sitting with people in difficult circumstances, of learning that most people are not waiting for answers. They are waiting for someone to ask the right question so they can find the answer themselves. She asked Marcus, one evening in June when he had stayed later than usual and the house was quiet, what he remembered best about his mother. He was quiet for a moment. He said he remembered that she was always doing two things at once, cooking and listening to the radio, reading and having a conversation, helping with homework and planning what needed to happen next week. He said she was the most capable person he had ever known, and he had spent his whole adult life trying to become the kind of person she would have approved of. Rosalind said, "Did you ever tell her that?" He said no. She said she knew. He looked at her. She said, "Those index cards. The one about you always coming back for seconds. She knew exactly who you were." He looked at the table. He said, "I should have been here more. These past 11 years, I should have been more present." He said it quietly, and it was not a question and it was not looking for absolution. It was just the truth of something, spoken plainly. Rosalind said, "You're here now." 3 words, she did not add to them. He sat with them. Walter came through to get a glass of water and said good evening to both of them and went back to bed, and the kitchen was quiet again. Marcus stayed another half hour. They talked about other things, smaller things. She asked about his company, and he talked about it with a frankness he didn't usually use, the parts that worked and the parts that kept him up at night. She listened the same way she listened to Walter, without hurry, without waiting to speak. He left at 10. On the drive home he thought about the index card. Make enough for leftovers, because Marcus always comes back for seconds. He had been coming back. All this time he had still been coming back, just slowly, just late. He drove home and the city was dark, and the card was on his refrigerator, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was moving in the right direction. Dana had her own version of this reckoning, quieter and less linear. Hers came out of an afternoon in late June when she was helping Rosalind in the garden, the small bed behind the house where Rosalind had started growing herbs in the spring, and they were working side by side, both kneeling in the dirt, when Dana said, without planning to, that she had wanted to call her father the night their mother died, but she couldn't because she knew he wasn't going to pick up. She had known even then. She had called Marcus instead. Rosalind said, "And Marcus came." Dana said, "He handled everything. Calls, arrangements, all of it. He was extraordinary." "But," Rosalind said. "But nobody held my hand," Dana said. "That's a small thing." "That's not a small thing," Rosalind said. They kept gardening. Later, Dana helped Rosalind carry the herb pots to the back step, and they washed their hands at the kitchen sink side by side, and Dana said, "I think I've been angry at Marcus for a long time. Not loudly, just underneath." Rosalind dried her hands. Dana said, "And I think he doesn't know." Rosalind said, "You could tell him." Dana looked at her, just like that. Rosalind said, "He's here more now, he's listening more. I think you might be surprised." Dana didn't say she would or she wouldn't. But the next time Marcus came on a Saturday and they were both in the yard while Walter napped, she said, not looking at him, watching a cloud move over the roof of the house, "I needed you more than you knew. After Mom, I needed you to stay and you went back to work." He was quiet. She said, "I'm not saying it to start something. I'm saying it because I need you to know." He said, "I know, I knew then too." He stopped. "I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to be inside it with you, so I did what I knew how to do." She said, "I know." They sat with that for a while. He said, "I'm sorry, Dana." She nodded. She looked at the roses. She said, "They came back. The roses, can you believe that?" He said, "Mom would have said she knew they would." Dana smiled, a real one. They sat in the yard for a long time, not talking, just sitting. The roses were blooming unasked as roses tend to do. The leaves turned in October and the mornings got sharp. Rosalind came into the kitchen one morning and found Walter sitting at the table with his reading glasses on and a piece of paper in front of him. He was writing something. His handwriting was careful and slow, and he was concentrating in a way that made his whole face still. She put the kettle on and did not ask. He said, without looking up, "I'm writing something down for Marcus and Dana. Things they should know. About the house. About some things their mother and I had talked about but never got around to saying out loud." He paused. He looked at his hands. "I don't know how much longer I'll have clear days," he said. "I want to use them for this." Rosalind said, "That's a good use." He went back to writing. She made breakfast and set it beside him and let him work. The letter took him 3 mornings. He gave it to Rosalind to hold until he was ready to give it to the children, which was what he called them and always would. He told her she could read it if she liked. She did not read it. She put it in the drawer by the refrigerator and left it there. It was not hers. The weeks that followed were ordinary in the way that the best weeks are. Rosalind and Walter went for walks when the air was clear. He told her stories about the early years of his marriage, about the house before it was the way it was, about the neighborhood before it changed, about Alina in the first apartment they shared, which was so small they had to turn sideways in the hallway to pass each other. He told her about Marcus as a boy, who had been serious and determined from almost the beginning, who had fixed his first bicycle himself at age 9 with a library book and sheer stubbornness, who had cried exactly once after Alina died, at the cemetery, standing completely still with tears going down his face without any change in expression, and had not cried again, as far as Walter knew, at any point in the 11 years that followed. Rosalind listened to all of it. She told Walter, on a Tuesday afternoon in November when they were back from a walk and warming their hands around their cups, a little about her own life. Not everything, a few things. About her years as a nurse, about the families she had lived with in this work, about the way each house was its own country with its own climate, and how she had learned to read that climate in the first few days and let it teach her what it needed. Walter asked about her family. She told him she had a son who had passed away some years before she came to America. She said it simply, without drama, the way she had learned to carry it, which was close but not heavy, present but not bleeding. Walter said he was sorry. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Is that why you do this work?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "Partly. I needed somewhere to put what I had left over, the caring that didn't have anywhere to go anymore." She paused. "But also I think I always knew how to be with people in the hard stretches, long before he died. It's just who I am." Walter nodded. He said, "Alina was like that. She could walk into a room and know what it needed. I never understood how she did it. I just knew the room always felt different after she came in." Rosalind said, "That's a real gift." Walter said, "Yes, it is." He looked at her across the table. He said, "She would have liked you." Rosalind smiled. She said, "I think I would have liked her too." Rosalind's contract was through the end of March. As February arrived and the days started to stretch a little longer, Marcus brought up extending it. He did not do it as a business transaction the way he had done the original hiring. He sat down at the kitchen table with her one evening and said that his father was better than he had been in years, that the family felt, for the first time in a long time, like an actual family, and he did not want that to change. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. She said she was glad for all of it, truly glad. She said she would not be staying past March. He asked why. She said there was another family, another house that had gotten cold and quiet, and someone in it who needed what she had to give. She said this was the nature of her work. She stayed until something started, and then she trusted it to continue. Marcus said, "What if it doesn't?" She said, "It will." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you are all showing up now. You don't need me to be the reason anymore." He did not argue, he understood. He said, "What you've done here, I don't have a word for it." She said, "You don't need one." The last week of March came quickly, the way endings do when you are paying attention. Dana visited every day that week. She and Rosalind cooked several of Aline's recipes together, with Dana writing the steps in a new notebook she had bought for the purpose. Rosalind walked her through each one, and Dana asked questions, and they laughed a lot, and Walter sat at the table and supervised with great authority, and only occasionally contradicted the instructions on the index cards. On Thursday evening Marcus came and they all had dinner together, all four of them, the table crowded in a way that felt right. Walter told a story about a fishing trip he and Aline had taken the year Marcus was born, a trip that had gone wrong in several directions, and ended with Aline laughing so hard she had fallen off a dock. They had heard this story before, Marcus and Dana, in a different life. They listened to it now like it was new. Rosalind drove herself to church on Friday morning, which she did every Friday if the weather cooperated. When she came back, she began packing her suitcase, slowly and methodically, the way she did everything. Saturday arrived cold and bright, the particular brightness of early spring that is more promise than warmth. Rosalind's suitcase was in the hallway. The small tin was on the kitchen counter, refilled by Dana, who had asked for the shortbread recipe 2 weeks earlier and practiced it until it was right. Walter was in the living room when she came in to say goodbye. He stood up from his chair, which took a moment and required the arm of it, and when he was up he stood straight. She went to him and they held on to each other for a long time, his thin arms surprisingly firm around her, and he said nothing. Neither did she. He sat back down, and she went to the kitchen for her tin. Dana hugged her at the door, a long hug, the kind that says what sentences can't quite hold. Dana said, "I don't know how to thank you." Rosalind said, "You already did, you showed up." Marcus walked her to the car. The morning was cold enough that their breath showed. He carried her suitcase and put it in the trunk, and then he closed it and stood there, the way he did when something needed to be said and he was finding the right words. He said, "You changed us." Rosalind opened the car door. She looked at him directly, the same way she had looked at him in that first interview, without performance, without softness that wasn't real. "You were already changing," she said. "You just needed someone to be in the room." She got in the car. He stood at the end of the driveway and watched her drive to the end of the street and turn. He stood there for a moment after she was gone. Then he went back inside. Walter was still in his chair. Dana was in the kitchen starting coffee. Marcus walked through and opened the cabinet above the bread box and looked at the cookbook, Aline Hale written in the front cover, Christmas 1988. He took it out. He sat down at the kitchen table with it. Dana set a cup of coffee in front of him, 2 sugars, 1 splash of milk. She tapped the spoon twice on the rim before she set it down, which she had started doing without realizing it, until one day she realized it and kept doing it anyway. Marcus turned the pages of the cookbook slowly. Outside, the morning moved past the window. Walter called from the other room that there was a bird back on the fence, a good one, a yellow one. Marcus looked up. He said, "I'll come see." He set the book down and went.